Hey everyone, my name is Dak. Welcome to my channel. I am retelling stories from the Bible in the best way I know how for you. If you're inspired by stories of faith, love, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe as it helps out a bunch. Thank you, and above all glory is to God. Introduction. Imagine standing among a crowd of over 5,000 people, men, women, and children, hungry, weary, and searching for something more than just a meal. Each person has come drawn by stories of Jesus' compassion in the miracles they have seen him perform. In this moment of deep need, someone steps forward with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. What happens next doesn't just fill empty stomachs, it reveals a truth that reaches far beyond physical hunger. This isn't only a story about a miracle, it's an invitation to discover what Jesus meant when he called himself the bread of life. As we look closer, let's consider why so many left everything behind to follow him into the wilderness. Thousands followed Jesus into the wilderness. Thousands made their way into the wilderness that day, leaving behind the routines and comforts of home. They walked dusty roads and rugged paths, some carrying children or helping elderly relatives along. There was no promise of a meal or a place to rest. Still, something about Jesus drew them out into that remote place. The stories about him had spread quickly, about how he healed the sick, restored sight to the blind, and spoke words that cut through confusion and fear. People heard that he didn't just talk about God's love, but actually showed it in ways they could see and feel. For many, life under Roman rule was filled with hardship. Heavy taxes and constant worry about illness made each day a struggle. Medicine was limited, and those who were sick often faced isolation. So when news came of a man who could heal and who spoke with kindness, hope began to stir. People longed for relief from pain, but also from the burdens they carried in their hearts. The miracles Jesus performed weren't just impressive, they were signs that God's compassion was real, and maybe, just maybe, something new was beginning. But the need went deeper than physical healing. Generations of Jewish people had waited for God to send a deliverer. The memory of God rescuing their ancestors from Egypt was still alive, especially as the Jewish Passover festival approached. Passover was a time to remember how God had provided and set his people free. Families gathered to tell the story of rescue, eating a special meal and recalling God's faithfulness. As this festival drew near, the crowd around Jesus couldn't help but wonder if God was about to do something remarkable again. Jesus seemed to embody the hope they celebrated every year, a hope for deliverance, for freedom, and for a new beginning. The crowd that gathered wasn't made up of just the curious. There were parents desperate for their children to be healed, elderly people longing for comfort, and young people searching for purpose. Some came because they had seen miracles with their own eyes, others had only heard his stories but wanted to believe they were true. Many felt spiritually lost, weighed down by life's disappointments and the strict rules of religious leaders. Jesus offered something different. He spoke about forgiveness and a kingdom where love mattered more than power. His words gave people a reason to hope for more than what they saw around them. As the sun climbed higher, people settled onto the grassy hillside. They pressed close together, eager to hear every word. Conversations buzzed quietly. Some shared stories of healings, others repeated phrases from Jesus' teachings. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something important to happen. But as the day went on, hunger and fatigue began to set in. The reality of their situation became clear. They were far from any town with no easy way to find food. No one seemed to have planned for such a large gathering. Most people probably left home in a hurry, not thinking about what they would eat later. There were no markets nearby, no vendors selling bread. The crowd's excitement slowly mixed with concern as stomachs began to rumble. It's easy to imagine the restlessness growing, children asking for food, parents worrying about how long they could stay. What started as a hopeful journey was now turning into a test of endurance. The disciples noticed the problem right away. They had seen Jesus do incredible things, but this was a different kind of challenge. Feeding a crowd this size seemed impossible. They looked at the thousands of people and realized they didn't have enough food or money to meet the need. The setting only made things harder. There was nowhere for people to buy food, and the number of hungry faces kept growing. Still, the reason people stayed was about more than just hunger. They were drawn by a need they couldn't quite name, a longing for connection, for meaning, for hope that life could be different. The Gospel of Mark describes the crowd as sheep without a shepherd. They were vulnerable, searching for someone to guide them. Jesus saw this as soon as he looked at the crowd. His response wasn't frustration or impatience. He felt compassion. He understood their struggles and their hopes. He saw not just their empty stomachs, but also their tired hearts. Jesus didn't see the crowd as a burden. He saw people who needed care and guidance. Just as a shepherd gathers and protects his sheep, Jesus was ready to meet both their physical and spiritual needs. His compassion was more than just a feeling, it moved him to act. The timing of all this mattered too. With Passover approaching, the crowd's memories of God's past deliverance were fresh. They remembered how God had provided for their ancestors in the wilderness, giving them manna to eat when there was nothing else. Now, in another wilderness, they looked to Jesus and wondered if he could provide for them too. As the hours passed and the need became more urgent, the disciples grew anxious. They worried about how to care for so many people with so few resources. Their practical minds searched for solutions, but none seemed possible. The idea of sending everyone away to find food made sense from a human perspective. It was the only option they could see. But Jesus was not limited by what seemed possible. Where others saw scarcity, he saw opportunity. He was about to show that God's provision goes beyond what we can imagine. The crowd sat on the hillside, unaware of the conversation taking place among the disciples. They didn't know what would happen next, but they waited, hoping for something more. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that feel overwhelming, where our resources seem small compared to the needs in front of us. It's easy to focus on what we lack or to feel discouraged by what we can't control. The disciples faced that same feeling as they looked at the hungry crowd and realized they had no solution. What happened next would challenge their understanding of what is possible. It would show that even in the most impossible situations, hope can appear in unexpected ways. As we move forward, let's put ourselves in the disciples' place and consider how we might respond when faced with a task that seems too big to handle. The disciples' dilemma, an impossible task. The disciples found themselves facing a challenge that felt far beyond their reach. As the day wore on and the crowd's hunger grew, the responsibility weighed heavily on them. Thousands of people sat scattered across the hillside, and the disciples stood nearby, aware that time was running out and no solution seemed possible. Their first instinct was to look at the situation logically, just as most of us would. The numbers didn't add up. There were about 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. The crowd was massive, far more than any of them had ever tried to feed before. The need was obvious, but so was their lack of resources. It wasn't just about food, it was about facing a need that seemed impossible to meet. Philip spoke up, voicing what everyone was thinking. It would take more than 200 denarii to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. In today's terms, that was more than half a year's wages. Essentially, all the money they had together wouldn't even begin to make a dent. Philip wasn't trying to be negative, he was just honest about how overwhelming the situation was. The disciples didn't have enough money, enough food, or enough options. Their focus was on everything they lacked. Another disciple, Andrew, tried to find a solution, even if it seemed small. He noticed a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish," he said. "But how far will they go among so many?" Andrew's question captured the doubt and uncertainty in the group. The offering was so small it almost seemed pointless to mention it at all. The disciples also suggested a practical plan. They asked Jesus if he would send the people away so they could buy food in the nearby villages. It made sense. They had no way to feed everyone, so maybe the crowd could take care of themselves. But underneath that suggestion was a sense of resignation. They simply couldn't see another way forward. Jesus' response caught them off guard. Instead of agreeing to send the crowd away, he turned to the disciples and said, "You give them something to eat." His words must have landed with a mix of confusion and disbelief. The disciples had just explained why it wasn't possible, and now Jesus was asking them to do exactly what they thought couldn't be done. It's easy to imagine the silence that followed. The disciples probably looked at each other, searching for answers. Maybe some felt frustrated, others embarrassed. They had already been through a lot. Earlier, they had come back from their own journey, tired and ready to rest. Now, they faced a need that seemed to have no solution. Their minds were filled with practical concerns, money, food, logistics. But Jesus wasn't focused on those details. He was inviting them to see things differently. Jesus didn't dismiss their concerns or pretend the need wasn't real. He recognized the hunger in the crowd and the worry in his disciples, but he wanted them to look beyond their own limitations. He didn't rush or panic. Instead, he calmly asked them to trust, even when it didn't make sense. His assurance stood in sharp contrast to their doubts. Andrew's mention of the boys' lunch was a small glimmer of hope, but it was mixed with plenty of uncertainty. 5 barley loaves and 2 fish wouldn't feed a family, let alone thousands. Barley bread was the food of the poor, simple and unremarkable. The fish were small, likely dried or pickled, more of a side than a meal. The offering seemed insignificant, almost laughable, yet it was what they had. The boys' willingness to offer as lunch is easy to overlook. In a crowd that size, it's possible others had food but chose to keep it hidden, unsure of what might happen if they shared. The boy, however, didn't hold back. He gave what he had, no matter how small it seemed. His act of generosity stood out, even though it didn't seem like much in the face of so much need. This moment brought everyone's doubts and hopes into focus. The disciples, struggling to see past their own limitations, had started searching for any possible solution, no matter how unlikely. The boy, with his humble offering, showed a simple kind of faith. He didn't know what would happen, but he was willing to give. Together, their actions set the scene for something unexpected. The need was clear, and so was the impossibility of meeting it with what they had. The disciples saw only scarcity. They knew there weren't enough resources, and their suggestions reflected that. Their focus was on what they lacked, not what might be possible with God's help. It's a feeling many of us know well, facing a challenge and seeing only what we don't have. Jesus, though, wasn't limited by those same boundaries. His calm in the face of the disciples' doubt pointed to a different kind of reality. He wanted them to trust not in their own ability, but in God's power to provide. The disciples' doubts didn't disqualify them. Instead, they became part of the story, a story about learning to trust when the answer isn't clear. The boy's small lunch placed in Jesus' hands became the turning point. It was a simple act, but it carried a quiet courage. The disciples might have doubted, but the boy's willingness to give what he had was a step of faith. It didn't seem like enough, but it was the beginning of something much bigger than anyone could have expected. As the crowd waited, the disciples watched and wondered what would happen next. The gap between the need and the resources was obvious. There was no way to hide how little they had. Yet Jesus wasn't worried. He was about to show them what can happen when even the smallest offering is given with faith. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where our efforts feel too small to make a difference. We see the needs around us and wonder if what we have is enough. The disciples' dilemma reminds us that it's not about having all the answers or enough resources. It's about being willing to offer what we can and trusting that God can do more with it than we expect. As the sun dipped lower and the crowd grew quiet, everyone waited to see what Jesus would do with the little that had been offered. The disciples had done what they could, even if it didn't seem like much. Now the story was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. What difference could one small lunch make in the face of such overwhelming need? The boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the midst of the crowd, a boy stepped forward with what he had, 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. His meal was simple, the ordinary daily bread of the poor, not the kind of food that would draw attention or admiration. Barley bread was rougher and coarser than wheat, a staple for those who had little. The fish were small, likely dried or pickled, meant just to make the bread easier to eat. Yet The boy offered his lunch, not because it was impressive, but because it was his to give. He didn't seem to hesitate or worry about what others might think. In a sea of thousands, his act could have easily gone unnoticed, but he brought what he had and placed it in Jesus' hands. There was no guarantee that his small offering would accomplish anything, still he gave it freely. He didn't try to solve the problem himself or wait until he had more to offer. He simply acted in faith. The humility of his gift stands out even more when you remember the culture of the time. In ancient Jewish society, children were rarely seen as important contributors. Their voices were often overlooked, and their actions didn't usually change the course of events. But here a child's willingness to give became the starting point for something remarkable. Jesus didn't overlook the boy. He accepted his offering and chose to begin with it. This quiet moment reminds us that God's work often starts with what the world might consider insignificant. Andrew, one of the disciples, noticed the boy and brought his small lunch to Jesus' attention. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish," he said, "but how far will they go among so many?" Andrew didn't hide his doubt. He acknowledged the gift, but couldn't see how it could possibly help. The disciples had already calculated the cost and found it impossible. Their focus was on what was lacking. They saw only the gap between the need and their resources. Jesus, though, saw something different. He didn't measure the boy's gift by its size or compare it to the overwhelming need. Instead, he saw the faith and generosity behind it. The boy's willingness to give, even when it seemed too small, became a lesson for everyone watching. It showed that the value of an offering isn't in how much it is, but in the heart with which it's given. This story invites us to think about our own lives. How often do we hold back because we think what we have isn't enough? Maybe it's not food, but time, a skill, or a word of encouragement. It's easy to believe that small acts don't matter, especially when the needs around us feel so great. But the boy's example reminds us that even the most ordinary offering can become something extraordinary in God's hands. He didn't try to multiply his loaves before offering them. He didn't ask for reassurance or proof that his gift would make a difference. He simply gave what he had, trusting that it would be enough in Jesus' hands. That's a kind of faith that doesn't demand recognition or certainty. It's a faith that says, "This is what I have, and I trust you with it." The rest was up to Jesus. With this small act, the story shifted. Jesus now held the boy's humble lunch. The disciples had voiced their doubts. The crowd waited, likely unaware of the details unfolding at the front. The boy had done his part, quietly, simply, and with trust. It's a reminder that God often uses the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary, and that our willingness to give, no matter how small, can be the beginning of something much greater. God isn't limited by the size of what we bring. He doesn't compare our gifts to those of others or wait until we have more to offer. He looks at the heart, at the willingness to step forward and trust. The boy's simple act of faith teaches us that we don't need to have everything figured out before we offer what we have. We just need to be willing to give, even if it seems small. It's also worth noticing that without the boy's offering, the story would have unfolded differently. Jesus could have chosen to provide for the crowd in any way he wanted, but he chose to use the boy's lunch. He took something humble and multiplied it until it became an abundance. This tells us something important about how God works. He doesn't just meet needs, he exceeds them, and he often invites us to take part in the process. He could do it all without us, but he asks us to bring what we have so we can experience being part of the miracle. As we reflect on the boy with his 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, let's consider what we have to bring. Maybe it feels ordinary or small. Maybe it seems like it wouldn't make a difference, but in God's hands no gift is too small. The boy didn't bring much by the world's standards, but what he did bring became the starting point for something unforgettable. Jesus took the offering, and everyone waited: disciples, crowd, and the boy himself. The disciples' uncertainty lingered, and the crowd's hunger remained. The boy had done all he could. Now it was up to Jesus to respond. In the next moment, with the simple meal in his hands and the eyes of thousands watching, Jesus prepared to act. Jesus' unexpected solution. Jesus' solution to the overwhelming hunger was nothing like what anyone expected. With the crowd watching and the disciples still unsure, he calmly told his closest followers, Have the people sit down." There was no hint of panic or frustration in his voice, just quiet confidence. The disciples moved through the crowd, relaying his instructions. People found places on the grass, settling into small groups. The hillside, which had been a swirl of movement and uncertainty, grew still. Can you feel the hush as everyone sat and waited? The disciples must have wondered what would happen next. They had counted the loaves and fish, and they knew the math didn't work. Yet here they were, following Jesus' direction, arranging the crowd for a meal that didn't seem possible. There was no sign of extra food, no hidden supply, just 5 loaves, 2 fish, and thousands of hungry faces looking on. Jesus then took the loaves and the fish. He didn't complain about how little there was or wish for more. Instead, he looked up and gave thanks to the Father. This wasn't just a routine prayer, it was a deliberate act of faith. In Jewish tradition, giving thanks before a meal was a way of acknowledging God's goodness even when resources seemed small. Jesus' gratitude was more than words. It was a statement of trust that God could provide, no matter how limited the offering looked. After giving thanks, Jesus broke the loaves and handed them to the disciples to distribute. There was no dramatic announcement or outward sign that something miraculous was about to happen. He simply started the process, trusting God to do what needed to be done. The disciples took the pieces and began moving through the crowd, offering bread and fish to each person. At first, it may have felt like a practical task, just passing out what little they had, but as they went from group to group, something changed. The bread and fish didn't run out. Each time a disciple reached into the basket, there was more to give. What began as a handful of food became enough for everyone. The disciples' doubts and calculations faded as they watched the food continue to appear. Imagine the crowd's reaction as the bread and fish reached them. Some may have hesitated, expecting only a small bite, but soon realized there was plenty. The quiet anticipation turned to surprise. People who had arrived hungry now found themselves with enough to eat. The disciples, who had worried about scarcity, now saw abundance unfolding in their hands. No one was left out. Every person, young and old, received food. There was no need to rush or worry about getting a portion. The supply kept coming, and the meal became a moment of shared relief and wonder. The hillside, once filled with the sounds of restless hunger, became a place of satisfaction and quiet gratitude. As the meal continued, the disciples may have exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what was happening. Earlier, they had only seen their own limits. Now they saw that God's provision could go far beyond what they expected. The simple act of giving thanks and trusting God had opened the way for a miracle. When everyone had eaten, Jesus told the disciples to gather the leftovers. They moved through the crowd, collecting what remained. To their amazement, they filled 12 baskets with the pieces that were left after everyone was satisfied. The abundance wasn't just enough, it was more than enough. The leftovers stood as a quiet testimony to God's generosity. The number 12 has meaning in this story. It reminds us of the 12 tribes of Israel, a sign that God's care extends to all his people. It also shows that God's gifts are not just for survival, but for fullness and abundance. What began with worry and doubt ended in a display of overflowing provision. This moment wasn't only about feeding a crowd, it was a lesson for everyone who witnessed it, disciples and families, parents and children. Jesus showed that God can use even the smallest offering when it comes from a willing heart. He demonstrated that gratitude and trust are the first steps to seeing God's work in our lives. The miracle also challenged the disciples' understanding. They had focused on what they didn't have, but Jesus invited them to focus on what God could do. Instead of sending the crowd away or giving up, he acted with faith. His example teaches us to bring what we have, however small, and trust that God will use it. For the crowd, this meal became more than food. It was a sign that God sees and cares for every need. In a world where scarcity often shapes our thinking, Jesus revealed a different reality, one where God's generosity meets us in our lack. The story also invites us to reflect on the times we feel overwhelmed by what we don't have. Maybe we face situations that seem impossible, or we wonder if our efforts matter. Jesus' actions remind us that faith begins with gratitude for what is already in our hands. It grows as we trust God to do what we cannot. As the sun set over the hillside, the crowd finished their meal. The disciples stood with baskets full of leftovers, still amazed by what they had seen. The people who had come hungry and uncertain now sat satisfied, their needs met in a way they never expected. This was more than a meal. It was a moment that showed the heart of God. The miracle of the loaves and fish wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about revealing the depth of God's care and the power of faith, even when the odds seem impossible. What would it feel like to witness a miracle that defies all logic? To see something unfold right in front of you that had no rational explanation? Jesus' computable stance we have, however small, and trust that God will use it. The miracle of abundance. The miracle of abundance unfolded quietly but unmistakably as the meal was shared across the hillside. The bread never ran out, no matter how many hands reached for it. The fish continued to appear, piece after piece, as the disciples moved through the crowd. What began as a modest meal for one boy became a feast for thousands, and not a single person was left hungry. The entire hillside, once marked by uncertainty and need, became a place of satisfaction and calm. For the disciples, this was a moment that shifted everything. Earlier they had counted the loaves and fish, measured the need, and found their resources lacking. Now, as they walked among the people, they watched in silent wonder, baskets brimming where they'd expected emptiness. Their doubts had given way to awe. Each trip through the crowd was a reminder that God's provision doesn't depend on human limits. The food in their hands was a tangible answer to their earlier worries. The crowd, too, felt the impact of this miracle. People who had arrived with empty stomachs and uncertain hopes found themselves fully satisfied. Scripture tells us that everyone ate until they were filled. This wasn't just a small snack to get by, it was a complete meal, enough for each person to feel content. The sense of relief and gratitude must have been strong as families shared food together, children laughed, and the worries of the day faded away. The miracle wasn't just about meeting a need, it was about experiencing God's generosity firsthand. Then came a detail that no one could have expected: the leftovers. After everyone had eaten, Jesus told his disciples to gather what remained. They moved through the crowd, collecting pieces of bread and fish that hadn't been eaten. When they finished, they found they had 12 baskets full of leftovers. This detail stands out for a reason. It's not just about avoiding waste. The abundance of leftovers is a sign of God's overflowing provision, a visible reminder that what God gives is more than enough. The 12 baskets carry meaning too. In the culture of Jesus' time, the number 12 was significant. It pointed to the 12 tribes of Israel, representing the fullness of God's people. It also matched the number of disciples, each one carrying a basket filled with evidence of the miracle. In this way, the abundance was a message not just for the crowd, but for the disciples as well. They were part of the miracle, entrusted with sharing and stewarding God's blessings. This act of collecting the leftovers also speaks to the importance of stewardship. Jesus didn't let anything go to waste. He valued the gifts that had been given, and he showed care for every piece of bread and fish. It's a quiet lesson in respecting what God provides, no matter how much there is. The disciples learned that God's generosity is not careless or random, it is intentional and complete. For those on the hillside, the miracle left a deep impression. Many had come seeking healing, hope, or simply a word of encouragement from Jesus. What they received was more than they could have imagined. The physical bread met their immediate hunger, but the experience itself pointed to something greater. They saw that God's care reached into every part of their lives, and that his generosity was not limited by what they could see or understand. This abundance wasn't just about food, it was a sign of God's character. Where the disciples saw scarcity, Jesus revealed provision. Where the crowd expected just enough to get by, they found more than they needed. This moment on the hillside became a living picture of God's kindness, a reminder that he gives freely, generously, and without reservation. The miracle also offered a glimpse of what God's kingdom is like. In the stories of Israel, God had provided manna in the wilderness, enough for each day. Here, Jesus provided bread in abundance, pointing forward to a time when all needs would be met and no one would go hungry. The overflowing baskets were a sign of hope, a promise that God's care is not just for the moment, but for the future as well. As the disciples stood with their baskets, the lesson was clear. They had started the day focused on what they lacked. Now they held in their hands more than they could have ever expected. Their role in the miracle was not just to witness it, but to participate in it, sharing, gathering, and learning what it means to trust God's ability to provide. The experience changed them, shaping how they would see future challenges and opportunities. The crowd, still gathered on the hillside, felt the weight of what had happened. The meal was over, but the sense of wonder remained. People looked at each other, quietly amazed by how their hunger had turned to fullness. The ordinary setting of grass and sky had become the backdrop for something extraordinary. The story of the loaves and fish would be told and retold, not just as a tale of food, but as a testimony to God's generosity. This miracle also invites us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we approach God with a sense of scarcity, worried that what we have won't be enough? The story reminds us that God's abundance is not measured by our resources, but by His love and power. Even when we bring only a small offering, God can multiply it in ways we can't predict. The 12 baskets of leftovers encourage us to trust that God's provision is not just sufficient, it is overflowing. It's easy to focus on what we lack, especially when faced with big needs or challenges. The disciples felt that pressure, and so do we. But Jesus' actions teach us to look beyond what we can see. He asks us to bring what we have, trust Him with it, and watch what He will do. The miracle of abundance is not just about bread and fish, it's about learning to rely on God's generosity every day. The scene on the hillside closed with a sense of quiet fulfillment. The crowd was satisfied, the disciples stood with baskets in hand, and the lesson of abundance lingered in the air. Jesus had met a physical need, but he was also pointing to something deeper. The miracle was a sign, a way of preparing the people for a greater truth that he was about to share. As the crowd settled and the day drew to a close, everyone sensed that something important had happened. The miracle of abundance was more than a meal, it was an invitation to trust, to hope, and to look for God's generosity in every part of life. The people may not have understood all the meaning in that moment, but they knew they had witnessed something that went far beyond ordinary experience. Soon Jesus would speak to the crowd about bread that never runs out. The miracle they had just experienced set the stage for a deeper conversation, one that would connect their physical hunger to a spiritual hunger only He could satisfy. The crowd, still gathered and attentive, waited to hear what Jesus would say next. Jesus declares Himself the bread of life. After the meal, Jesus chose this moment near the time of Passover and witnessed by thousands to reveal a truth that reached far beyond the miracle they had just seen. He didn't focus on the bread and fish or the excitement of the crowd. Instead, he began to teach about something greater than physical bread. This teaching is found in all four Gospels, but John's account highlights its timing and depth. Jesus wanted those listening to understand that the miracle was more than an act of compassion. It was a sign pointing to a deeper reality. The people listening still remembered the bread in their hands, the fullness in their stomachs, and the wonder of seeing so much come from so little. Many were amazed, some hopeful, and others simply curious. They had heard stories of prophets and teachers, but this felt different. Some wondered if Jesus would keep providing for them day after day, meeting their needs, just as Moses had led their ancestors through the wilderness. But Jesus did not let their hopes settle on the physical or the temporary. He wanted them to see a need that went further than hunger. Jesus spoke plainly, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. These words were simple, but their meaning was profound. Bread was a daily staple, essential for survival. By calling himself the bread of life, Jesus was saying that he alone could satisfy the deepest needs of the human soul. He was not just another teacher or miracle worker, he was offering himself as the answer to the hunger every person feels, the longing for purpose, forgiveness, and connection with God. When Jesus said, I am, he used language that everyone there would recognize. It was the same phrase God used when he spoke to Moses from the burning bush, I am who I am. For the Jewish people, these words pointed to God's eternal, unchanging nature. By using them, Jesus was making a bold claim. He was not only sent by God, he was God, present among them. This was more than a metaphor, it was a declaration of his identity and his mission. Jesus also reminded the crowd of their history. He said, Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. The manna story was close to their hearts. God had provided bread from heaven to feed the Israelites as they traveled through the desert. But that bread only lasted for a day, and those who ate it still faced hunger again. Jesus was offering something different, bread that endures, bread that gives eternal life. He made it clear that the miracle they had just experienced was a sign, not the main point. The people had come looking for another meal, another sign of God's power. But Jesus pointed them to something far more important. He said, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. He was inviting them to move beyond their physical needs and see their spiritual need for Him. The bread they had eaten on the hillside was temporary, but the life he offered would last forever. This teaching was not easy for the crowd to accept. Many had followed Jesus because of what he could do for them, healing, feeding, helping with their daily struggles. They wanted a leader who would solve their problems. But Jesus was offering himself, not as a means to an end, but as the end itself. He was not promising political freedom or daily miracles. He was promising a new kind of life, one that began with faith in him. Jesus' words also connected to the Passover season. Passover was a time to remember how God had delivered his people from slavery and provided for them in miraculous ways. The unleavened bread of Passover was a symbol of God's rescue and faithfulness. Now Jesus was saying that he was the fulfillment of everything Passover pointed to. He was the true bread from heaven, given so that anyone who believes in him would have eternal life. This was not just about remembering the past, it was about receiving something new in the present. The crowd's response was mixed. Some were drawn to Jesus' words, sensing that he was offering something more valuable than anything they had known. Others struggled to understand. They wanted proof, something they could see and touch. Still others grumbled, questioning how someone they knew could make such claims. Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, "I came down from heaven"? Their questions showed just how difficult it was to move from the familiar to the unknown, from physical needs to spiritual truth. Jesus did not back down. He continued, explaining that the bread he offered was his own life, given for the world. He spoke of believing in him, of trusting that he alone could give life that never ends. He invited everyone listening to come to him, to receive what only he could give. The promise was not for a select few, but for anyone who would come in faith. This moment was a turning point. The miracle of the loaves and fish had drawn a crowd, but Jesus' teaching called for a decision. Would they seek only what he could do for them, or would they trust him for who he was? Would they settle for temporary satisfaction, or would they accept the invitation to eternal life? In our own lives, it's easy to focus on what we need right now: answers to prayer, help in a crisis, solutions to problems that feel urgent. But Jesus' words remind us that our deepest need is for him. Physical bread can fill us for a day, but only Jesus can fill us forever. The hunger of the heart is not satisfied by things, achievements, or even miracles. It is satisfied by a relationship with the one who calls himself the bread of life. Jesus' invitation is simple but challenging. Come to me, believe in me. You will never hunger or thirst again. This is not about earning or deserving, but about receiving what God freely offers. Just as the crowd did nothing to earn the bread on the hillside, we do nothing to earn the life Jesus gives. It is a gift given out of love. This teaching also asks us to trust, even when we don't understand. The crowd struggled with Jesus' words because they wanted something familiar and controllable. Faith means stepping beyond what we can see and trusting the one who sees the whole picture. Jesus asks us to come to him with our questions, our doubts, and our hopes, and to believe that he is enough. The miracle of the bread and fish was a sign, but the real gift was Jesus himself. He is the bread that endures, the source of life that never ends. His words still invite us to come, to believe, and to find in him the satisfaction our hearts long for. As the teaching ended, some in the crowd turned away, unable to accept what Jesus offered. Others stayed, drawn by the hope and promise in his words. For those who remained, and especially for the disciples, this moment became a lesson that would shape how they saw Jesus and what it meant to trust him. Something had shifted, not just in what they believed, but in how they would live from that day forward. Lessons for the disciples: trusting God's power. For the disciples, the feeding of the 5,000 was more than just a moment of amazement. It was a lesson about what it means to trust God's power when human solutions run out. Standing in the middle of a hungry crowd, they faced a need that seemed impossible to meet. Their first thoughts were practical and honest. Philip looked at the crowd and quickly did the math, realizing just how far short their resources fell. It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. When Andrew pointed out the boys' small lunch, he couldn't help but ask, "But what are they for so many?" Both responses show how easy it is to measure our problems by what we can see and hold. The disciples saw only what was missing. Their suggestions were the kind that make sense when we feel overwhelmed. They wanted to send the crowd away, hoping people could find food on their own. It was practical and it was honest, but underneath, it was also an admission that they didn't believe anything more could be done. They were out of options, and their sense of responsibility gave way to resignation. Sometimes the most honest thing we can say is, I don't know how this will ever work out. Jesus didn't criticize their doubts. Instead, he gave them a task that seemed unreasonable. You give them something to eat. It was a challenge that pushed them beyond their comfort zones. In that moment, Jesus wasn't asking for a plan or for more resources. He was inviting the disciples to see what happens when they put what little they have into God's hands. The lesson didn't start with abundance. It started with honesty about need and a willingness to trust Jesus even when the answer wasn't clear. The miracle itself unfolded in a way that drew the disciples right into the heart of the lesson. Jesus took the loaves and fish, gave thanks, and began to break the bread, handing it to the disciples to distribute. They didn't just watch from a distance, they were the ones carrying the food, moving from group to group, watching as the bread never seemed to run out. Every time they reached into their baskets, there was more to give. The miracle wasn't just something they observed, it was something they experienced with their own hands. As each basket returned full, the disciples' perspective shifted. Their doubts and calculations were replaced by a quiet awe. They realized that God's provision wasn't limited by what they could see or count. The lesson was clear. When Jesus is present, scarcity gives way to abundance. The disciples learned that God's power is not measured by human limits. The abundance of leftovers made the lesson even more striking. After everyone had eaten their fill, the disciples gathered 12 baskets of broken pieces. This detail was not just about avoiding waste, it was a visible reminder that God's provision always exceeds expectations. The number 12 likely reminded them of the 12 tribes of Israel and their own place as Jesus' chosen followers. Each disciple held a basket full of evidence that God's generosity is never in short supply. This moment on the hillside became a turning point for the disciples. They started with doubt and ended with awe. The miracle showed them that God can use even the smallest gift, offered in faith, to meet needs far beyond what we imagine. It was a lesson they would carry with them, not just for that day, but for every challenge ahead. Jesus was teaching them that faith is not about having all the answers. It's about bringing what you have, however small, and trusting God to do the rest. The story of the loaves and fish is not just about what happened long ago, it's about the way God invites us to trust Him with our needs today. We all face moments when our resources seem too small and our problems too big. The disciples' journey from doubt to faith encourages us to look beyond what we lack and focus on what God can do. Jesus didn't need a banquet to feed the crowd, he needed willing hearts and a simple offering. If you're facing your own hill of impossible needs, what small gift might you bring to Jesus today? Maybe it's a little bit of time, a word of encouragement, or a willingness to help someone else. Maybe it's simply your honest prayers, offered in faith even when you're not sure what will happen next. Whatever it is, remember that God can do more with your willingness than you can imagine. The disciples' experience reminds us that God often uses the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. He invites us to participate in His work not because He needs our help, but because He wants us to experience what it means to trust Him. The miracle didn't just change the crowd that day, it changed the disciples, teaching them to see God's power at work in the middle of their own doubts and limitations. As you think about your own life, consider where you might be holding back because you feel what you have isn't enough. The lesson for the disciples, and for us, is that small offerings in God's hands can become more than we ever expect. Jesus takes what we bring, however simple, and uses it to meet needs, build faith, and show His love. The feeding of the 5,000 stands as a reminder that God's provision is not just about meeting needs, but about inviting us into a relationship of trust. The disciples learned that faith grows when we step out, even with uncertainty, and place what we have in Jesus' hands. Their story is an encouragement to anyone who feels overwhelmed by life's demands. So when you find yourself facing a situation that seems too big, too complicated, or too far gone, remember the disciples on the hillside. They started with doubt, but as they trusted Jesus, they discovered that God's power goes far beyond human limits. You don't have to have it all figured out. You simply need to bring what you have and trust that God can multiply it. The miracle of the loaves and fish is more than an ancient story. It's a living example of how God meets us in our need, invites us to trust, and shows us that with Him nothing is impossible. The disciples learned to see beyond their own limitations and to rely on God's strength. That same invitation is open to us today. As we move forward, let's take the disciples' lesson to heart. When we face our own impossible moments, when the need feels too great and our resources too small, let's remember to bring what we have to Jesus. Trust that He can do more than we expect. The story challenges us to shift our focus from scarcity to faith, from what we lack to what God can do. This lesson prepares us to look at our own lives and ask, how does this miracle speak into the challenges we face right now? What difference does it make for us here and today? What this miracle means for us today. When we look at the story of Jesus feeding over 5,000 men, plus women and children, we see more than just a miracle from the past. This story speaks right into the places where we feel stretched thin, where we face needs that seem much bigger than what we have to offer. The miracle is a reminder that no resource is too small for God to multiply. Even the smallest act of faith, when placed in His hands, can lead to something far beyond what we can imagine. Think about times you felt like you didn't have enough money, enough energy, enough answers. Maybe you've worried that your efforts wouldn't make a difference or that your best would still fall short. The disciples felt that way too. They saw the hungry crowd and immediately focused on their lack. Their questions, how can this possibly work out? And what good is this little bit among so many? Are questions we all ask when life feels overwhelming. But Jesus did not ask the disciples to solve the problem on their own. He simply invited them to bring what they had. The boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish didn't wait for a perfect moment or a bigger gift. He gave what he had, and Jesus received it without hesitation. That act of trust was all it took. The miracle began not with abundance, but with a small, willing offering. This tells us that God is not limited by what we lack. He is looking for hearts that are willing to trust Him, even when the offering seems small. This story encourages us to shift our focus. It's easy to get caught up in what we don't have and let that shape our view of what's possible. Scarcity can take over our thinking, making us believe that our contribution is too small to matter. But Jesus shows us a different way. He invites us to look beyond our own limitations and to see what He can do with what we bring. When we trust Him with our resources, our time, or even our simple willingness, we open the door for God's abundance to meet us. The abundance in this miracle is striking. Not only did everyone eat until they were satisfied, but there were 12 baskets of leftovers. This detail is more than just a number. It shows that God's provision is generous and overflowing. He doesn't just give enough to get by, He gives more than we expect, reminding us that His care covers every need. The 12 baskets also point to God's care for all His people. Just as there were 12 tribes of Israel, each disciple gathered a basket, holding in their hands a visible sign of God's faithfulness. Today, God's abundance might not always look like bread and fish, but it can be just as real. Sometimes it's encouragement when you need it most, peace in the middle of anxiety, or a solution you never saw coming. Other times it's the strength to keep going, or the comfort of knowing you're not alone. God's provision meets us in the ordinary moments of life, turning what seems small into something more than enough. Maybe you're facing a situation right now that feels impossible. You might be wondering if what you have is enough to make any difference. This story invites you to trust that even the smallest gift matters to God. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to solve every problem on your own. God asks you to bring what you have and trust Him with the outcome. Let's take a moment to reflect. What is the loaf and fish in your life? It could be your time, your skills, your encouragement, or even your prayers. Whatever it is, God can use it in ways you might not expect. The boy in the story didn't know what Jesus would do with his lunch, but he was willing to give it. That willingness is what God uses to bring about transformation. The miracle also reminds us that God cares about every part of our lives. He sees the needs that weigh on us, and He invites us to bring them to Him. When we focus only on what we lack, we miss the opportunity to see what God can do. Jesus didn't just meet the crowd's physical hunger, He used the moment to point to a deeper truth. He wanted the people to see that He is the source of true satisfaction. This lesson is not just for the big, dramatic moments, it's for the everyday challenges that leave us feeling empty or uncertain. When you're tired, discouraged, or unsure of what comes next, remember that God's abundance is not limited by your resources. He can bring hope and provision right where you are. Sometimes, the miracle is not in the solution itself, but in the way God multiplies what we bring. A kind word, a small act of service, or a simple prayer can have effects far beyond what we see. God uses ordinary people and ordinary gifts to do extraordinary things. The story of the loaves and fish is proof that nothing is too small for God to use. It's also a call to trust. The disciples learned that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about stepping forward with what you have, even if it feels small. Jesus didn't criticize their doubts or their questions. He simply invited them to participate in what God was doing. The same invitation is open to us. When we bring our needs, our hopes, and our small offerings to God, we become part of His work in the world. Take this with you today. No resource is too small for God to multiply. Your willingness, your faith, and your trust are enough for Him to work with. When you face moments of scarcity, remember that God is not limited by what you see. He is able to provide in ways you might never expect. This story also invites us to see our lives through the lens of abundance, not scarcity. Instead of focusing on what we lack, we can look for the ways God is already at work. We can trust that He will meet our needs and that He can use us to bless others. The miracle of the loaves and fish is not just about meeting needs, it's about revealing God's character as generous, caring, and faithful. As you go through your day, ask yourself, what small step of faith can I take? What can I offer, even if it seems insignificant? God sees your heart, and He delights in using what you bring. Your part might seem small, but in God's hands it can become the start of something much greater. Let's remember that Jesus' invitation is ongoing. He doesn't just want to meet our immediate needs, He wants to draw us closer to Himself. The miracle on the hillside was a sign pointing to something deeper, a relationship with the one who gives life that truly satisfies. When we trust Him with what we have, we discover that His provision is always enough. As we reflect on this story, we see that God's abundance is not just for the past, it's for today, for every need and every moment of trust. The miracle of the loaves and fish calls us to bring our small gifts, to trust God with the outcome, and to believe that He can do more than we imagine. In the end, the lesson is simple but profound. God uses what we offer, multiplies it, and meets needs in ways that go beyond our understanding. His invitation is to trust, to give, and to discover that with Him there is always enough. And as we consider what this miracle means for us today, we are invited to look beyond the immediate and ask what it reveals about the one who provides, not just for our bodies, but for our deepest needs. The bread that truly satisfies. Every person has a longing for something that lasts, a kind of satisfaction that doesn't fade with time or change with circumstances. This is the heart of what Jesus meant when He called Himself the bread of life. After the crowd experienced the miracle of the loaves and fish, their immediate hunger was satisfied. But Jesus wanted them to see that the true miracle wasn't just about food, it was about the kind of fulfillment only He could give. Bread was a basic need in ancient times, just as it is in many places today. People depended on it to get through each day. When Jesus used bread as a metaphor, He was connecting with everyone in the crowd. He knew they understood what it felt like to be hungry, to need something outside themselves to survive, but He also knew that physical hunger is only one part of our lives. There's a deeper hunger inside every person, a spiritual hunger for meaning, hope, and peace. Jesus' words, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst, are more than just a comforting promise. They are an invitation. He was offering himself as the answer to our deepest needs. The crowd had seen him multiply bread and fish, but now he was asking them to believe that he could do even more, to fill the emptiness that nothing else could reach. The miracle of the loaves and fish pointed to something greater, that Jesus himself is the source of life that truly satisfies. When Jesus spoke about being the bread of life, he was making a claim that went beyond being a teacher or a miracle worker. He used the words, I am, echoing the name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. This was a bold statement. Jesus was saying he is God, self-sufficient, eternal, and able to give life that never ends. He wasn't just offering a better way to live, he was offering himself as the foundation of a new life, one that is anchored in God's love and grace. The people listening to Jesus wanted more signs, more miracles, more bread. They remembered how God gave manna to their ancestors in the wilderness, bread from heaven that appeared each morning. But Jesus reminded them that even those who ate the manna eventually died. The bread he offered was different. You remember the manna that fed your ancestors but didn't last. I offer bread that endures forever. He was inviting them to trust him for something that wouldn't run out or fade away. This kind of satisfaction is different from what we find in achievements, possessions, or even relationships. Those things can bring happiness for a while, but they don't last. Sooner or later, the hunger returns. Jesus was honest about this. He knew that people often look for fulfillment in things that can't truly satisfy. He wanted them, and us, to see that the answer isn't in getting more, but in coming to him. Coming to Jesus means more than just believing he exists. It means bringing your whole self, your hopes, your struggles, your questions to him. It's a choice to trust that he can meet your needs, even the ones you can't put into words. When Jesus said, "Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst," he wasn't talking about physical hunger and thirst. He was talking about the longing for acceptance, purpose, and peace that every person feels deep down. Believing in Jesus is about more than agreeing with what he said. It's about trusting him with your life. It's about letting go of the things you turn to for temporary comfort and choosing to rely on him instead. That can be hard, especially when life is uncertain or when we feel like we need to hold on to what we have. But Jesus' invitation is gentle and open. He doesn't ask us to have it all together. He simply says, "Come." Sometimes we approach God with a list of what we need: help with a problem, relief from stress, answers to hard questions. Jesus sees those needs and he cares about them, but he wants to give us more than a quick solution. He wants to give us himself. He wants us to know the kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, the kind of hope that lasts even when things are hard. The miracle of the loaves and fish shows us that Jesus cares about our everyday needs. He met the crowd where they were, with food for their bodies, but he also pointed them to something deeper. He wanted them to know that the greatest gift he could offer wasn't more bread, but a relationship with him. That's what it means to have the bread that truly satisfies. If you've ever felt like you're searching for meaning or chasing after things that don't last, you're not alone. We all have moments when we wonder if there's more to life than what we see around us. Jesus' words are for those moments. He says that when we come to him, we'll find what we've been looking for. We'll find a satisfaction that doesn't fade, a love that doesn't fail, and a purpose that endures. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy. There will still be challenges, disappointments, and times when we feel empty. But Jesus promises to be with us in those moments, to fill us with what we truly need. He takes the small faith we bring and multiplies it, just as he did with the bread and fish. Our part is simply to come, to trust, and to receive what he offers. It's easy to fall into the habit of looking for quick fixes or temporary relief. We might try to fill the emptiness with work, entertainment, or even good things like family and friends. But none of these can take the place of what Jesus offers. He is the bread that truly satisfies, the one who meets us right where we are and gives us more than we could ever earn or deserve. Take a moment to consider what you're hungry for in your own life. Is it peace, acceptance, hope, or something else? Whatever it is, Jesus invites you to bring it to him. You don't have to have a perfect faith or all the right answers. You just have to come believing that He's enough. When we accept Jesus' invitation, we find that the things we used to chase lose their hold on us. We discover a freedom that comes from knowing we are loved, known, and cared for by God Himself. The bread He gives isn't just for today, it's for every day, for every season, for every need. Jesus' promise is simple but profound. He says that if we come to Him and believe in Him, we will never be hungry or thirsty in the ways that matter most. This is a promise that holds true no matter what life brings. It's a promise that has comforted people for generations and continues to offer hope today. Let's remember that the miracle on the hillside wasn't just about meeting physical needs. It was about showing us that Jesus is the only one who can satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts. He is the bread that truly satisfies, the one who gives life that never ends. As you reflect on this, consider sharing one way you've seen small faith grow into something great in the comments. Your story could encourage someone else who is searching for hope, and as you think about what Jesus offers, ask yourself, what will you trust Him with today? Conclusion. As we come to the end of this story, we see a simple truth. When we offer what little we have to Jesus, He can turn it into more than we ever expected. The boys' 5 loaves and 2 fish were not much on their own, but in Jesus' hands they became enough to feed thousands. This miracle shows us that God is not limited by what we lack or by the size of our resources. Whatever you are facing, remember that God welcomes even the smallest step of faith. He is able to use your offering, no matter how small, for something greater. Thank you for joining me today.